In a valley where winters lasted longer than patience, people trusted only what their grandparents had trusted. So when she rebuilt her old house and announced she would sleep on a heated stove bed inspired by northern China, laughter followed. "Stone beds are for museums," they said. She smiled and kept working. The concept was simple but unfamiliar. A masonry bed warmed by smoke channels from a small stove, releasing heat slowly through the night. No flames in the bedroom. No roaring fire. She studied old diagrams, adjusted the dimensions to her home, and built it with local clay, brick, and stone. Nothing fancy, nothing modern. The first real cold arrived early. While neighbors fed their stoves, every few hours, she lit hers once before sunset. By midnight, the room was still warm. By morning, the bed radiated steady heat, like sunlight trapped in stone. She slept through the night without adding a single log. Weeks passed. The laughter faded into curiosity. She began tracking her firewood stack and realized something fell off. It was barely shrinking. By midwinter, the numbers were undeniable. She was using nearly 60% less firewood than previous years. No drafts, no freezing mornings, just slow, stored warmth. By late January, neighbors stopped joking. They started asking questions. How hot did it get? Was it safe? Could it be built in an old house? She answered calmly, knowing the stove bed hadn't changed. Only the way people looked at it had. People began stopping by under innocent excuses. A borrowed tool. A quick question. They always lingered near the bed. Some removed their coats without noticing. The warmth wasn't aggressive. It was quiet, constant, and impossible to ignore. She explained it patiently. The stove burned hot and fast, sending smoke through channels beneath the bed before exiting the chimney. Instead of losing heat to the sky, the stone absorbed it for hours. Less fire, less smoke, less work. The idea sounded almost too reasonable. In February, a storm knocked out electricity across the valley. Space heaters died instantly. That night, her house stayed warm. The stove bed didn't hum or glow. It simply did what it was built to do. By morning, word spread faster than the snowplows. One neighbor brought a thermometer. Another counted logs. They compared notes and did the math themselves. No tricks, no exaggeration, just physics and patience. The laughter from autumn felt distant now, almost embarrassing. By the end of winter, someone else started building one. Then another. Slightly different designs. Same principle. She watched from her window as stone beds appeared where jokes once lived, knowing the idea had finally outlasted the noise. When people asked how much it had cost her, the answer surprised them. No imported parts, no complex machinery, just time, planning, and materials already familiar to the valley. The real expense, she said, was trusting an idea everyone dismissed. Before the stove bed, mornings meant cold floors and ash-stained hands. Now, she woke to warm stone and a quiet room. There was no rush to relight a fire, no panic about losing heat overnight. Winter mornings became slower and gentler. Another change became impossible to ignore. Her chimney released far less smoke than the others. While thick plumes marked most rooftops, hers stayed nearly clear. Less firewood meant cleaner air, and the valley noticed. People who once mocked the idea now asked for sketches and measurements. She shared what she knew, warning them not to rush. A stove bed punished impatience, but rewarded precision. Every channel, every curve mattered. By late winter, she understood something deeper than efficiency. The warmth felt human, steady, forgiving, and calm. It didn't demand constant attention. It allowed life to continue without the noise of survival. March arrived with a final warning from winter. Temperatures dropped lower than anyone expected, and firewood piles vanished fast. She burned the same amount she always did, and stayed warm. Wind howled against the walls for 3 nights straight. While others woke repeatedly to feed their stoves, she slept uninterrupted. The stone held the day's heat like a memory, releasing it slowly until morning. By the end of the cold snap, the math was undeniable. Her total firewood use for the season was just over 40% of what she once needed. The Chinese stove bed was no longer a nickname. It was a solution. Conversations changed. People no longer asked if it worked, but why it worked so well. Respect arrived quietly, without apology, settling in like warmth through stone. That winter became a reference point. Before the stove bed, after the stove bed, not because of one woman's invention, but because she trusted patience over noise. Spring arrived, melting the last snow, but the lessons remained. She invited neighbors to see the stove bed up close, explaining every channel, every brick, every curve. People took notes, sketched diagrams, and even measured her materials. Curiosity replaced doubt. Soon, neighbors began building their own versions. Some experimented with height, others with stone thickness. She helped where she could, guiding hands that had once pointed in mockery. Now, they built with respect. As more stove beds appeared, the valley itself changed. Fewer chimneys released thick smoke, and the air grew noticeably clearer. Children played outside without coughing, and the morning smelled like frost rather than fire. She started documenting the process, creating drawings and notes for future generations. The stove bed wasn't just a way to save firewood. It was a lesson in patience, observation, and trusting old wisdom. Even visitors from distant villages came to learn, taking the idea far beyond her valley. By the following year, no one laughed anymore. The stove bed had proven itself economical, safe, and sustainable. What began as ridicule became respect, and what was once a lonely experiment became a village tradition. News of her stove bed traveled beyond the valley. Curious travelers arrived in early autumn, notebooks in hand. They asked questions, took photos, and marveled at how simple materials created such effective warmth. She explained everything openly, but emphasized the subtle details. How you shape the channels, how tightly you fit the stones. That's where the difference lies, she said. Visitors realized it wasn't magic. It was careful observation, design, and patience. Some builders asked if the stove bed could work in newer houses with wooden floors. She experimented carefully, adding insulation and safety measures. The results were just as remarkable. Warmth without constant tending, less fuel, and quieter nights. The next winter arrived, harsher than the last. Her stove bed performed perfectly. The neighbors' copies worked too, and some even improved upon the design. For the first time, the valley experienced a winter without frantic firewood collection. By spring, the valley's landscape had changed. Stone beds appeared in nearly every home, a symbol of wisdom over mockery. She looked around, realizing her experiment had become a legacy, teaching that sometimes the quietest ideas leave the deepest warmth. With multiple stove beds now in use, families gathered around them in the evenings. Stories, laughter, and the aroma of simmering tea filled homes. The warmth created more than comfort. It fostered connection. She began teaching her children and nieces how to build and maintain the stove bed. Observe, don't rush, she reminded them. The skill became a rite of passage, linking generations through both tradition and innovation. Travel writers and historians came to the valley, fascinated by how one idea reshaped a community. They documented the stove beds, the clean air, and the cooperative spirit that had grown from a simple experiment. Photos circulated, inspiring others in colder regions. The village noticed other benefits. Less firewood meant more trees remained standing, the valley stayed greener, and fuel expenses dropped. What started as a way to stay warm had turned into an early form of sustainable living, rooted in observation rather than technology. By the third winter, everyone was ready. No one scrambled to gather firewood at the last minute. No one woke in the night shivering. The valley had learned patience, planning, and the power of a thoughtful design. The last few skeptics finally joined in. They measured, sketched, and built their own stove beds, amazed at how simple changes could make a house so warm. The laughter that once greeted her idea had completely vanished. Children grew up watching the rhythm of the stove bed, how a single fire could last through the night, how heat moved through stone, and how patience mattered more than constant effort. It became an informal education, teaching physics, observation, and respect for materials. Tourists left the valley with diagrams, measurements, and inspiration. Soon, stove beds appeared in neighboring villages, adapted to different homes and climates. Her innovation had traveled far beyond the snow-covered valley. The village held an informal festival every winter, celebrating the stove bed's warmth and the unity it brought. Neighbors shared food, stories, and advice for maintaining the stone beds. The winter that had once been feared became a season of preparation and community. The stove bed quietly changed lives. It taught that ingenuity doesn't need to be flashy, that tradition can meet efficiency, and that respect often follows persistence. What started as ridicule ended in a silent revolution of warmth and wisdom. By now, she began explaining the science behind the stove bed in small village gatherings. Smoke channels, stone heat retention, and airflow became topics of fascination. People realized the bed wasn't just tradition, it was practical engineering. She organized small workshops for anyone interested in building their own. Neighbors and visitors alike came with notebooks, sketches, and questions. Each workshop ended with hands-on practice, laughter, and warm beds for everyone. Children who had grown up with the stove bed began experimenting. They tested different stone thicknesses, stove placements, and insulation techniques. Some even created miniature models, showing a new generation how curiosity can solve practical problems. Word of her invention spread across other valleys. Travelers shared stories of warmth and efficiency, and more families adopted the stove bed. She smiled quietly, knowing that her small, patient work had ripple effects far beyond her home. Winter arrived again, but this time, fear was gone. Families slept peacefully, mornings were calm, and firewood lasted longer. The stove bed had turned harsh winters into a gift, warmth, comfort, and community. She realized that true innovation doesn't need applause. The stove bed had changed the valley quietly, one house at a time. No headlines, no awards, just measurable warmth, less firewood, and happier mornings. By midwinter, the stove bed became the standard in nearly every home. Guests visiting the valley expected warm stone beds, not roaring fires. Even the oldest skeptics admitted it. Some traditions were worth rediscovering. The stove bed taught more than energy efficiency. It taught patience, observation, and care in building something that lasts. Neighbors began applying the same mindset to gardens, food storage, and even community decisions. On the coldest nights, she sat quietly on her stove bed, feeling the stone absorb her weight and warmth. The room was calm, silent except for the faint crackle of the distant stove. It was a comfort unlike any she had ever known, steady, reliable, and deeply satisfying. The valley had entered a new era. What began as a ridiculous idea became a valued tradition. The stove bed wasn't just a bed or a heating system. It was proof that persistence, patience, and respect for wisdom can change lives forever. Visitors carried the idea to distant villages and even towns. Letters and sketches arrived, asking for advice on adapting the stove bed to different climates and house styles. Her small experiment had become a source of inspiration far beyond her home. Families who adopted the stove bed no longer feared harsh winters. They woke to warm floors, calm mornings, and fewer trips to gather firewood. The simple act of storing heat in stone transformed life for everyone. She taught young apprentices not only how to build the beds, but also how to observe, measure, and respect materials. The lessons went beyond heating. Patience, diligence, and humility became part of the curriculum. Her legacy was becoming a living skill, not just a story. As stove beds became common, the community thrived in small ways. Less firewood meant more trees. Less smoke meant cleaner air, and nights spent together around the warmth encouraged stronger bonds. The valley had become healthier, closer, and wiser. By the end of the season, everyone remembered that first winter differently. Not as harsh or punishing, but as the one that taught innovation, patience, and trust in careful planning. What began as laughter had turned into respect, and a tradition that would last for generations. Even with the stove beds, winter still tested the valley. Blizzards arrived unexpectedly, and nights grew darker and colder than usual. But now, families faced these challenges with preparation, confidence, and steady warmth. Some villagers experimented with small improvements, insulating stones, adjusting smoke channels, or slightly raising bed height. Each adaptation improved efficiency while maintaining safety. The stove bed became not only a tradition, but also a canvas for creative problem-solving. Evenings were different now. Families no longer fussed with tending fires constantly. Instead, they shared stories, played games, and planned the next day. The stove bed had free time and energy for life, not just survival. Tourists and scholars began visiting regularly, documenting the stove bed and its effects. They recorded data, asked questions, and sometimes built small models to take home. Her invention had become both a practical tool and an educational experience. As winter faded, she looked at the valley transformed. Stone beds in every home, smoke lighter in the air, and families more connected than ever. The stove bed was no longer just hers. It was the valley's legacy, proving that simple ideas, when nurtured, can change the course of life forever. The stove bed quietly became the hero of each home. No fanfare, no announcements, just warmth that let people sleep, cook, and live without worry. The villagers began appreciating the quiet power of thoughtful design. She gathered children around the stove bed, showing them how the smoke channels worked and how the stone retained heat. "Observe and respect the material," she said. The lessons extended beyond warmth. They taught patience, care, and foresight. People from nearby towns arrived, bringing notebooks and questions. She shared diagrams and measurements, demonstrating how small changes in design could adapt the stove bed to any house. Her quiet innovation was becoming a regional phenomenon. What started as a strange, laughed-at experiment became a shared tradition. Families no longer questioned the idea. They embraced it, adapted it, and passed it down to their children. Winter itself became a season of ritual and preparation rather than fear. As the last snow melted, she sat on her stove bed and reflected. The valley had transformed. Warmer homes, cleaner air, and stronger communities. Her patience, ingenuity, and persistence had created more than a bed. It had created a legacy. The following winter brought familiar cold and snow, but the valley was ready. Families relied on their stove beds, confident that warmth would last through the longest nights. The anxiety of firewood shortages and freezing mornings had become a thing of the past. Villagers began helping each other improve their stove beds. They shared tips on insulation, stone placement, and stove efficiency. What had begun as a solitary innovation had turned into a collaborative community effort. Scholars and curious travelers continued to visit, eager to learn and record data. They were fascinated by the simplicity and effectiveness of the design. Drawings, photographs, and measurements spread the knowledge even further. The village celebrated the season with a small festival. Families showcased their stove beds, shared meals, and exchanged stories of ingenuity and warmth. The festival became a new tradition, blending comfort with community pride. She reflected on her journey, how ridicule turned into respect, how a simple idea could transform lives. The stove bed had proven that careful observation, patience, and persistence could create lasting impact. Winter was no longer feared. It was an opportunity to demonstrate wisdom and foresight. Word of the stove bed spread beyond neighboring valleys. Families in distant regions wrote, asking for advice, sending sketches and questions about adapting the design to their homes. Her quiet invention was traveling farther than she had ever imagined. Some visitors made subtle improvements, like better insulation or minor channel adjustments. Each adaptation proved that the original design was versatile and scalable. The stove bed had become a foundation for innovation rooted in tradition. In winter evenings, families shared their experiences with the stove bed. Stories of nights slept warm, mornings without frost, and reduced firewood became common conversation. The stove bed had created not only physical warmth but social warmth as well. She continued to teach children and apprentices, emphasizing observation and slow, deliberate construction. The lessons went beyond heating. They taught patience, precision, and respect for both nature and craftsmanship. A generation grew up understanding the value of mindful work. As snow melted for the season, the villagers reflected on how far they had come. The once laughed at stove bed had become a symbol of wisdom, resilience, and innovation. Winter was no longer a threat. It was a season to demonstrate foresight and community spirit. By now, stove beds were appearing in several nearby valleys. Travelers reported seeing warm homes with stone beds, even in remote villages. Her small experiment had inspired a regional shift in winter living. Visitors and locals alike began studying the stove bed's efficiency. Thermal properties of stone, heat retention, and airflow became topics of discussion. What was once considered folklore now had measurable, undeniable proof. Homes with stove beds reported warmer nights, less firewood use, and healthier children. Parents no longer worried about freezing floors or constant fire tending. The quiet reliability of stone heat changed daily life profoundly. Communities began celebrating stove bed evenings with tea, music, and storytelling. The ritual reinforced family and neighborly bonds, making winter a time of connection rather than hardship. The stove bed had become more than a tool. It was part of cultural life. She looked over the valley as snow blanketed the rooftops. Every house had a stove bed, and every family slept warm. Her innovation had transformed the way people lived, survived, and thrived through winter, proof that patience, observation, and care could leave a lasting legacy. Years had passed since she first built the stove bed. Sitting quietly, she observed the valley transformed, families thriving, children playing in the snow, and smoke rising lightly from chimneys. Her invention had outlived skepticism and laughter, leaving behind lasting warmth and wisdom. The stove bed had become more than a home fixture. It was a symbol of ingenuity and resilience. Parents taught their children the design, maintenance, and lessons of patience it embodied. The knowledge was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the entire valley. Letters, sketches, and photographs from faraway villages arrived regularly. Communities inspired by the stove bed adapted it to their climates and homes. Her simple idea had grown into a movement, proving that thoughtful innovation could transcend borders. Winter was no longer a season of fear or struggle. It had become a story of preparation, collaboration, and comfort. Families gathered around their stove beds, sharing warmth, stories, and laughter, just as she had envisioned decades ago. The Chinese stove bed, once mocked, now stood as a testament to patience, careful planning, and quiet innovation. It transformed lives, communities, and even entire valleys. And as snow continued to blanket the rooftops, the warmth of stone beds proved that sometimes the simplest ideas leave the deepest mark.